The isekai genre has been one that people have ran into the ground, but not in the way that you're probably thinking. In the Western anime world, it's considered something of a black sheep genre and is constantly memed on for one reason or another. From either side of the discussion, people tend to get very toxic when it comes to this, and it's very apparent as to why. There are several factors that cause it to get like this, and give birth to this unbearable cycle. People liked isekai for years, but they never really knew what it was until it was popularized within the past decade. It was pretty amazing to see at the time, 20-something-odd-year-old anime genre get revitalized, but with that popularity came a lot of people that disliked the genre just because of that alone. While there were some people that criticized it for justifiable reasons, that's not what we're talking about here today. These criticisms that I'm talking about are completely different, because they were based on either nitpicks or valid criticisms that lost their original meaning somewhere over the years. Isekai is very much linked to Sword Art Online, since it repopularized the genre in anime as well as written materials, so people just sort of pushed how they felt about SAO onto a genre that it's, ironically, not even a part of. After SAO's first season had come and gone, that dead horse was so well beaten that they had to move on to something new, and Isekai was prime material for the community. When anitubers were on the rise and started mimicking the popular opinion of the Western anime community, that was ultimately when this massive hate for Isekai began. The popular opinions about Isekai was all based around the same surface level nitpicks to frame the genre as negatively as possible. One of the most common things you would hear get thrown around is how the protagonist is an overpowered audience self-insert, which you'll know is a complete lie if you've ever watched an isekai. People throw around so many lies when talking about this genre that you're likely to run into a lot of people that are just afraid to admit that they love isekai, notably the genre's anti-fandom. When you listen to the community, you'll hear lots of complaints from people saying that isekais are the same story done over and over, and that they use the same time period so that they can get away with previously established world building. How people talk about the genre is very reminiscent of how people treated slice of life shows back in the 2000s, except it's in a new coat of paint. The common criticisms that these two genres share is something along the lines of they use the same setting, they go through the same events, the protagonist is a shameless audience proxy, the protagonists all look the same, and that the genre does nothing new. Just like the slice of life genre, these criticisms were all easily disproved. You could see that they are all bullshit if you watched more than one episode from a series within the genre. People who mindlessly hated the genre made up all the lies they possibly could to deter people from watching it, and these criticisms people gave became warped with every appearance like it was a game of telephone. To really get this started, let's address one of the most common lies. People say that isekai is generic. The reason why this is such a blatant lie is that isekai is one of the most diverse genres within anime. The basis of this lie comes from the fact that many isekai share a similar world and plot structure. Because of that, people believe that the genre is some sort of lifeless money printer. A lot of isekais have protagonists that share some of the same physical qualities, but they look past that to say that every protagonist is the same. They completely avoid talking about the things that make them different, both in their designs and how they grow as characters. This part of the isekai is generic lie is what I find to be the most bizarre, because the protagonists are also different. Some may be based around similar kinds of people, but no two of them are the same. Take, for example, Shin Wolford from Wise Man's Grandchild and Toya Mochizuki from Smartphone Isekai. Both are very similar in their basic designs, but they're two completely different characters in every other aspect. The only other similarities between them is that they save two girls in an alleyway, and that their isekai worlds are relatively modern. Both characters are seen as overpowered audience proxies by the community, but the only character that comes even remotely close to that descriptor is Toya. Toya is overpowered, but his existence is a joke towards the genre, since it makes fun of the more common tropes that you would find within it. On the other side, Shin is a character that takes a more realistic approach, since the series tries to handle things without making light of the genre. They're both fundamentally similar characters, but how their stories are handled makes them go in two completely different directions. To add even more to the lie that isekai is generic, let us talk about how some believe that all of isekai's overpowered protagonists are an audience proxy. While people might relate to characters like these to some degree, relation doesn't mean that the characters themselves are garnered to be the audience's proxy. It's relatively hard to even argue that without knowing the authorial intent that the creator has for a series. While the genre has a set target in mind, every author views that target differently, and it's shown in how the characters are treated within their respective series. To think that a protagonist from any isekai is an audience proxy is simply just an assumption that very heavily relies on how a viewer thinks that someone would love to be in any given world that these protagonists take a part in. A thing about that mentality is that it completely overlooks what a protagonist would go through within this world. Some isekai worlds would undoubtedly be cool to be a part of, but people wouldn't want to suffer in order to enjoy that. The isekai series that have slice of life elements, however, is something that you'd more likely see someone want to insert upon. These kinds of isekai worlds tend to go heavy into world building, and as a result, they have what some would call an overpowered protagonist. The only time these kinds of characters are ever used is when the series wants to set a somewhat laid-back tone to focus upon different aspects of the genre. However, because of that, it brings us into the next Lie of Isekai, and this one has a lot of misconceptions with it. The genre contains a fairly decent amount of protagonists that are strong, but they're not all overpowered. It really depends on what kind of fantasy the isekai is going after. They tend to use a similar starting outline for the protagonist depending on what they're aiming for. To build upon what I mentioned a few moments ago, you mostly see the overpowered kind when it's in a lighthearted fantasy. Lighthearted fantasy isekais typically star characters with abilities that are above average to better than everyone else in their original lives. These characters are usually strong before coming into another world, and they're usually very capable. The worlds that they are forced into are great places which the protagonist usually falls in love with. These kinds of isekais will sometimes have slice of life elements, and with the protagonist's abilities, it makes a great choice for series that want to focus more on other aspects. Because of this, the lighthearted fantasy isekais tend to take the heroism route. However, you will get the occasional lighthearted fantasy isekai that focuses on literally building the world. This is the kind of isekai that this lie is based around. With how the protagonists of these isekais are, it was very easy for people to spread the lie. After all, if you include a smidgen of truth within a lie, people are more inclined to take your word for it. People say that these kinds of protagonists are audience proxies, but you'll find that while people have a lot of fun with these kinds of characters, they don't usually find themselves in their shoes. That more comes into play with the protagonists of dark fantasy isekais. Within those, the protagonists are usually average to below average in their abilities from their former life. They're usually weak in some form, be it mentally, physically, emotionally, or any combination of the three. These stories tend to showcase a gradual progression of the protagonists earning their strength of choice through their own hard work rather than a natural gift, even in fringe cases where their initial power was granted to them, such as Naofumi Iwatani from Shield Hero. Of course, there are even more variations between these, and you can apply some of these things to other kinds of fantasies, but these are the only two types that I can confidently talk about. A lot of people within the community have become very complacent with just writing off these next couple of lies as the truth, because they hear them so very often from people that don't even bother watching the genre. The first one that comes to mind is people saying that isekai is just a power fantasy, or wish fulfillment, which is just incredibly untrue. In order for something to be a power fantasy, the main character has to be essentially perfect and get everything that they want with absolutely no downside to their decisions. If you actively watch isekai, you already know why this is such an untrue lie. There may be some protagonists that get better treatment than others within the genre, but there is a very minute amount of isekai out there that would qualify as wish fulfillment or power fantasy. Even if that lie actually turned out to be true, so what? That's not a criticism. If people talked about its execution, that'd be a different story. Whenever someone brings up this lie, they're almost never criticizing how it's executed though. They're just saying that a story having that automatically makes it bad. Let's look at Knights and Magic for a second. It is undeniably wish fulfillment, but it's that way to have a uniquely fun experience for the viewer. How good it is lies upon whoever chooses to watch it, but its choice to be wish fulfillment doesn't negatively impact its job as a work of fiction, as that choice works for the better because of how it's written. A series that I commonly hear people toss around the power fantasy, audience proxy, and wish fulfillment lies at is my favorite isekai, Arifureta. To show you an example of how wrongly these are thrown around, you have to first take a deeper look at Hajime. He is the complete opposite of these lies. Both before and after he gets isekai'd, he's not someone that you'd really see yourself in. There may be some parts of him where you can sympathize, but the average viewer wouldn't be able to fully place themselves in him. He's completely ostracized from the people around him, and before the fall, he only had one person who he felt he could be comfortable around. Practically his entire existence is something that is hated over such a petty reason as he's friends with a girl that half of his class likes. He's tossed into his own veritable hell, and is forced to crawl out of that all on his own. To top things off, there are very few moments in the series where things go exactly the way Hajime wants them to. All he wants to do is go home, but things keep getting in his way. Next, we'll talk about some misconceptions brought through misinformation or some other form of misunderstanding. One of the common misconceptions people have about isekai is that they all take place within the same time period, the Middle Ages. Isekai span through many different time periods, and while the most common is the medieval era, that's only just a fraction of them. However, time periods in general are kinda hard to talk about in the genre. Some isekais have a very solidly set time period if you pay attention to the kinds of technology that they use. On the other hand, some isekais can be a mishmash of different technologies from different time periods, and that's where a lot of this misconception comes from. There's only really one part of this where I sympathize with those who criticize this aspect. There are a lot of isekais that take place in the medieval era, and because of that, even I would love to see isekais take on a different time period. The thought of an isekai in the future, or even a prehistoric setting, is something I'm raring to see out of the many possibilities that this genre can hand you. This next one is something I consider a lie because of how people treat it as truth, but it is ultimately a misconception since it stems from people not fully understanding something. Character design. No doubt you've heard at least one person within the anime community say that a lot of the isekai protagonists look the same or are practically carbon copies of one another. There are characters that share similar appearances, but that really doesn't make them the same, and I have absolutely no clue how there are people out there that unironically believe that. To base the critique of a character solely on how they look is dumb enough on its own, but if you look much closer at their designs, you'll notice that they're all different. I hate that this is thrown around so much, because it really banks off this ideal that all isekai are copy and pasted money machines, which is just blatantly false. On the topic of something similar with how it's treated, there's a decent amount of the anime community that believes this genre doesn't world build, that they just simply use the fantasy setting as a way to half-ass a story. While this lie isn't wholly unique to isekai, it really tells you how little people actually pay attention to the genre. Like with other genres, there may be a few series that lack world building, but it's very unfair to just apply that to the genre as a whole when most typically have a lot of it. With some series, it's a lot of the more subtle facets that get built, such as the inner workings of smaller fantasy villages and how the civilians get by in life. Series like that may have very little building into the fantasy elements because they work more into making their world have more life in its people. Some series delve pretty deeply into the more fantastical elements, but they might not have as well developed people and civilizations as a series that focuses on that kind of thing. More often than not, isekais tend to balance out their world building between these two aspects. These aspects are what I feel ultimately makes an isekai an isekai. There's honestly a lot more care put into the world building than people give the genre credit. Not balancing this out tends to make an isekai feel like another genre entirely, and I believe the poor balancing that a few of the series have in this regard is what makes people believe fantasy series like Danmachi is somehow an isekai. Series like The Master of Ragnarok comes to mind when I talk about something that has an imbalance with these aspects. The fantasy building of the anime is there, but it's not really built upon outside of the protagonist's ability to contact his former world. The civilization aspect of the show, however, seems to be built a lot more carefully, and it manages to create this lively atmosphere for its towns and people. The series as a whole borrows its fantasy lore from Norse mythology, and doesn't really seem to build a lot upon it outside of a few classifications. The example I like to use for a good balance of these aspects is Re:Zero. It has such a vibrant world in both its aspects of civilization and fantasy elements. Everything within it feels finely tuned, like clockwork. It does go heavy into the building of its fantasy elements, but it doesn't neglect the civilization aspect. It might not be a perfect balance, as there are some parts where it isn't built quite as good, but the way its world building is handled is something that I feel more series should strive for, all the while carving out their own unique paths. This ideal is why Arifureta is ultimately my favorite isekai. A lot of fiction out there has a large amount of overlap, but you don't really see people tossing around anything even remotely close to these sorts of lies. The closest the anime community has really even seen to this was with Slice of Life, and to an extent Ecchi and Harem, a little more than a decade ago. It just seems like the closer to real life something appears to be within an anime, the more people try to say it's all the same. Conversely, the more unlike real life something is, the more people tend to say it's trying too hard. These are both really common things within the anime community as a whole, but they're always amplified because of the unjust bias people have towards isekai. Isekai has a lot of potential, but people tend to use that as if it's some sort of negative, implying that isekai isn't even good enough to live up to that potential. Isekai is just as unique as any other genre, but it manages to stand out because it actually does live up to its potential. Isekai has limitless possibilities in what it can be, arguably even more than a normal fantasy series. It pains me to see people seem to think that it can't live up to its potential because every series isn't completely different in every aspect. Just looking at the Western anime community, you can tell that people over here don't truly want a unique experience. Every isekai I've come across in the past year have been wholly new experiences that contained a lot of what I've seen people saying that they wanted in an isekai. You want to know how that ended? The majority of people tossed them aside for the very lies I talked about in this video. If it wasn't those lies, it would be about how it looked or because it didn't agree with their politics, which is just an incredibly sad thing to give up on a series for. Isekai is so much better than people in this community give it credit for, and I want people to realize how much they just don't want others to enjoy isekai. While there is an increasing support towards isekai in more recent years, there's still way too much negativity because of these lies. It'd be different if there were more legitimate criticisms, but I only ever see people base their opinion on isekai around at least 2 of these lies. I've seen legitimate criticisms about isekai over the years, and while I don't agree with a lot of them, I can understand where they're coming from. The real problem that surfaces is the fact that those actual criticisms get muddied by people that mix their nitpicks in with it. The majority of the lies I've talked about here stems from common criticisms that even I could see myself getting behind, but they all turned into something else once someone latched onto them for all the wrong reasons. I want to see more good faith criticisms when discussions for isekai take place. For example, like I said before, I'd personally love to see isekais that take place in more futuristic settings. I'd also love seeing more isekais where the most prevalent city in their world isn't based around the ideal medieval city, though this is a criticism of mine that can be applied to the fantasy genre as a whole, because that model is used everywhere. That walled city design is great when it's used for medieval settings, but it becomes very distracting when you see it in something more modern. That's all of the most common lies and misconceptions that I've heard, so I'm gonna pass off the rest of this video to my friend Leth. I wouldn't skip this one if I were you though. He's got some interesting things to talk about before we end this off.
Is anyone still there? No, don't go! Vel said stay until the end. Anyway, if you're still there, hello, hi, I'm that lazy lethargic anime YouTuber who doesn't upload very much because making videos is hard work. And I'm featuring in this video today because it's a lot less effort for me to appear in someone else's video for a bit than to make my own video on my own channel, because I'm lazy. And also because Vel makes some really good points about the isekai genre being unfairly treated by the larger community over the last decade, and I have some things to add myself. So, as we all know, I'm a big fan of Sword Art Online anime of the summer. Mail and that's an isekai. I mean, no, it's not. Sword Art Online is not an isekai. People think it is for some reason. Kinda weird. Anyway, I'll stop making awful jokes and I'll actually start making some points now. Sorry Vel, gotta throw my awful unfunny dry sense of humour into everything I do. Can't help myself. So first of all, I'd like to further expand on one of the lies that Vel already talked about earlier, that being the lie that isekai is generic and that a lot of shows are the same. Sure, a lot of isekai series are similar in terms of story structure and setup, but that's kind of a given because it's, you know, a genre. And therefore shows within it are going to have similar setups because that's kinda how genres work. I mean, Isekai is a genre focusing on the protagonist being transported to another world different from our own. I mean, are the people who criticise the similarity in premises between shows seriously trying to say that they're all the exact same because they're all based around the core thing that makes an Isekai an Isekai? Like, just take a step back for a second. Imagine if you tried to argue this point about any other genre in anime. Imagine if someone took a bunch of sports anime and tried to say they were all the same because they all focus on a sport, completely ignoring that each series focuses on a different kind of sport. Or in cases where some shows focus on the same sport, they still have their own unique way of showcasing that sport and doing things. Wouldn't that be kinda silly? A flat out lie? Yeah, it would be. But putting all that aside, the isekai genre is far more diverse and unique than people would like to admit, and I'd like to illustrate this by using a few of my own examples. Problem Children Are Coming From Another World, Aren't They? Is a pretty good example of this. Yeah, it's a series where a trio of teenagers from a world get transported to a fantasy world, are granted special powers and decide to use said powers to influence the world around them in a positive way. But what makes the show unique is that each of the three protagonists come from a different era in our world. Iezoi is a high school student who's from the present day, Asuka is from the time immediately after World War II, and Yo is from a distant future where technology has advanced far beyond what it is today. And seeing these three characters from different time eras interact with one another is pretty interesting and makes for some really great character chemistry that stands out from other isekai. How about the more recent show? Didn't I say to make my abilities average in the next letter? Jesus Christ, why do I keep picking these shows with stupidly long titles to talk about? If there's any criticism I can give isekai, it's these really long, hard to remember titles and make reading this script way harder than it needs to be. So, Noken, as it's more commonly referred to because that title is too long, is another really unique isekai that I saw a lot of people write off as more of the same because the premise focuses on a super powerful protagonist who is adorable, look at her, who can effortlessly defeat just about everyone she comes into contact with. But what makes Noken stand out is that the protagonist Mio doesn't really want to use her crazy powers or talent. Truth be told, she doesn't want them at all because in her previous life as a high school student, in our world, she was amazing at everything and it made it difficult for her to blend in and live an average carefree life. She views being revived in this world as a second chance, a chance to live that carefree, quiet life that she always longed for, and thus does everything she can to hide her super powerful ability, which often results in some amazing comedic moments where she accidentally shows off her true potential and ends up incredibly frustrated that people are going to find out that she's special because she doesn't want to be special. Oh, and you know, the show is also about a bunch of cute moe girls going on adventures in a fantasy world that is apparently heavily inspired by the JRPG video game series Atelier, which someone watching this video that we're both friends with will definitely be sure to let everyone know about in the comments. Hi Alice. There's That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, which again, while familiar in its setup, stands out by spending the first episode slowly building up the main character Rimura's set of skills, and showing him gradually become more powerful over the course of the episode. The series then shifts its focus primarily to having Rimuru build his own society within the isekai world, and how said society interacts with and influences the rest of the world, and all while the main character himself is a dopey cute little slime who can shapeshift and use all kinds of crazy monster abilities. Rising of the Shield Hero is a darker revenge-driven take on the typical fantasy-styled isekai where the hero who is someone from our world is looked down upon and ostracised by the inhabitants of the world and wrongfully branded a criminal. Drifters has various historical warriors from different time periods transported to a dark fantasy world where the human inhabitants are at war with a group called the Ends that is comprised of powerful dictators and rulers from our history that were also transported to this world. Cautious Hero, the hero is overpowered but overly cautious. On paper, sounds like your average overpowered protagonist isekai series. Except it's not, because the hero is so overly cautious and overprepares himself to such an insane degree that he never gets anything done in ample time. And while this originally seems like a stupid gag, the show eventually reveals that the reason behind this is much more tragic and much more serious than it seems. ReZero, Overlord, Gate, Magic Knight Rayearth, The Vision of Escaflowne, Konosuba, No Game No Life, Ascendance of a Bookworm, Inuyasha, Log Horizon, The Familiar of Zero. All of these shows, every single one of them, has something that makes them stand out from one another. They have their similarities, as is the case with shows in any genre, but they're all very different and unique in so many ways that I could be sat here all day explaining how and why. To say that all of these shows are exactly the same is incredibly disingenuous, and if you were to make that claim about any other genre in anime you'd be mocked, but isekai bad and generic, I guess? The next lie I'd like to tackle is this really weird idea that I've seen floating around a lot recently, that most isekai protagonists lack any notable flaws and are perfect in almost every way. And truth be told, I'm not really sure where this one came from, given that most of the isekais I've seen, the main character always has at least one notable flaw that undermines their more impressive or superior character traits. As I mentioned earlier, Seiya from Cautious Hero is a pretty good example of this. He's overpowered, yeah, and he can take out pretty much every opponent he faces with little effort, but this is all undermined by his insane need to over-prepare himself and ensure that he's guaranteed a flawless victory with little to no risk. This need to be prepared as possible often causes the other heroes in the story, as well as innocent bystanders, to be left struggling against extremely powerful villains. And it's all because of Seiya's cautious nature that stems from his traumatic past. On the other side of the coin, there's Hajime from Arifureta, who starts out as anything but flawless, being a weak and timid character with no real talent. A character who's ostracised by everyone around him. In fact, he's so ostracised that he's more or less left to fend for himself in a perilous dungeon full of powerful monsters. Even after he becomes stronger and more competent as a protagonist, he remains far from perfect, often needing to rely on his newly found companions to get through the toughest of conflict. And there's now Fumi from Rising of the Shield Hero, a character who reaches such a low point in the beginning of the story, being branded a criminal, left with nothing, that he purchases a slave and forces her to be his companion. And while his relationship with said slave eventually evolves from mere slavery into one of love and trust, he continues to go through constant hardships and emotional turmoil over the course of the entire series. It pretty much takes the entire first season of the anime for Naofumi to be absolved of the crimes he was falsely accused of. And if that isn't flawless, then I don't know what is. So, while we're on the subject of slavery and Shield Hero, how about the lie that Isakai glorifies slavery? Yeah, you've probably seen this one kicking about for a while now. A lot of people in the community seem to think that Isakai is constantly using slavery as a narrative device, and that by doing so, the genre actively supports it. Except that when you really take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the number of Isakai that actually use slavery as a narrative device is really small in number. I mean, there's the aforementioned Shield Hero, obviously, and that's the big one that people tend to single out in making this argument. Although, honestly, I really question if anyone who uses it as an example of a show that promotes slavery actually watched the fucking show, because the show actually condemns the act of slavery and portrays it in a very negative light. Although Naofumi does originally use the slavery system to gain a companion by force, he later regrets his decision, realises it's wrong, and declares his slave Riftalia to be a free woman. And I mean, what other shows are there? How not to summon a demon lord? I guess? Well, there's not really an instance where said slavery is really explored, and the protagonist actually spent a good chunk of the series looking for a way to remove his slaves' collars because he views them as companions? Like, there's an entire episode dedicated to them trying to remove the collars? Did people watch the show? There's Death March to the Parallel World Rhapsody, which I actually hadn't seen prior to writing this part of the script, and for the sake of getting my facts straight, I actually decided to watch the show, and yeah, doesn't glorify slavery at all. In fact, Sato actually saves the girls from slavery and frees them immediately. Freeing slaves is supporting slavery now? I guess? And what other shows even are there? I honestly can't think of any other notable examples where slavery is even really mentioned, let alone used as a primary plot device, and I've seen most of the isekai that have come out over the last decade and beyond. So, yeah. I don't know what people were talking about. Did I have any other lies I wanted to tackle? Nah, not really. Anything else that I've wanted to say has already been covered pretty extensively by Vel, so I guess I'll just pass things back over to her. Oh, and before I go, check out A1 Pictures' new anime series, Sir.
Anyways, I'm not saying that you should like all isekai, or even like isekai in general. I just want people to give the genre a chance where their thoughts are unhindered by the blatant falsities the community spreads. If you still find yourself disliking isekai after getting past all of the misinformation, that's fine. All that matters in my head is that you gave it a chance, and I can't knock you for at least doing that. All I really want is an anime community where people don't feel like they have to hide things that they love in order to save face in front of others. The things you love should be like a badge of honor. Take pride in it. Wear it proudly. That's why I mostly do my videos on animes that are either lesser known or have a bad reputation in the Western community. We can't have healthy discussions if we all have the same tastes, after all. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing. If my content doesn't interest you but you'd like to interact with me, I have a Twitter where I shitpost, talk about anime, and sometimes even games. I also have a Discord group if you'd like to be a part of the community, but not deal with the hellhole that is Twitter. Links for this, as well as Leth's, will be in the description. One last thing before I go. I'm really happy that Isakai has started getting more vocal support in the West in recent times. While everyone may not see eye to eye with me, that bit of positivity is what motivates me to continue doing what I do even 2 years down the line. I appreciate y'all.